Good morning, beautiful people. It is great to be with you all today. I hope that you're all doing well. I bring greetings from students in Ukraine, Poland, and Slovakia. I spent all week virtually teaching a class there, and so they say hi. But they seem to be going through a little bit of a challenging time at the same time. So in your prayers, you might remember the churches and the ministers ministering in Ukraine and Slovakia and Poland as they try and minister in the midst of quite a challenging scenario. Let's read our text together, Genesis chapter 2, verses 23 through 24. If you'll read that with me, please. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." I remember Aurora's and my wedding. At least I say that, and I wonder if you're the same as I am. I remember bits and pieces. There was so much going on that day, so much craziness that I remembered. I remember it being a great day, but I remember flashes. I remember when I brought my friend some pants I'd bought for him because he was one of my groomsmen, and I thought he told me he was a 30-32. He was a 32-30. That was fun. I remember bits and pieces along those lines, and I remember it being a great day. I remember Aurora and her wedding dress and how wonderful that was. And I remember when we got into my Buick Park Avenue, because that's a real romantic thing to get into, my green Buick Park Avenue, and drove off. And I remember when we got to the hotel, and I was still in my suit, she was still in her wedding dress, and we go up to the front desk, and we go to check in, and they don't have our reservation. And there are no other rooms. I started hearing no room at the inn going on and started to be confused and concerned. But nevertheless, we began to walk out, and all these people are looking at us, and they look at the poor lady there at the front desk. You turn them away? But no, it turns out I can't drive and have no sense of direction. Our hotel was across the street. I remember all these little things and all this fantastic, you laughed way too hard at that one. I remember all these things. It's all part of the memory, right? All part of the joy of that love story. And then we got home. And you know what we discovered? After the wedding, after the honeymoon, turns out work started. Life started. And marriage has been wonderful and it's been magnificent, but it turns out it's also a lot of work. Why is marriage difficult? Why is it a lot of work? Why can it be hard? I think we get a glimpse in Genesis chapter 2. I know we just read it, but do me a favor, humor me anyways, and let's turn there. Genesis chapter 2. And I wonder, how many Bibles do we have? What a fantastic sight. Genesis chapter 2. I want us to look at verses 23 through 24. 23 through 24. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." One flesh. Two things become one. That's what makes marriage difficult. It's two things becoming one. There's not many places in our world where two things become one, at least not when it's a good thing. You know what we usually call it whenever two things become one? A traffic accident. That's what we call it. Don't jump ahead of me. No, marriage is not a traffic accident. Some of you went there. I didn't say that. What I am saying is that two things becoming one is a little unusual. It's kind of hard. Now, notice the text says two things become one, as though it happened immediately. And that's true, it did. But there's this principle in Scripture. It's the already but not yet principle. You're familiar with it. That we already are children of God. But not quite as much as what we will be when we are in His presence for eternity. We already have the guarantee of heaven. But not quite as much as what we will when we're actually in heaven. It's the principle of already but not yet. I've already got a little bit of it, but not as much as what we will. That husband and wife, the moment they become husband and wife, become one, but not as much as what they will. If we went around this room today and we talked to couples who'd been together for 30, 40, 50 years, I have a suspicion that their level of oneness now would be more than what it was, or at least we kind of hope it is. Because there's the process of becoming one. Becoming one in all aspects of life. Becoming one in the way finances are viewed. Becoming one in the way career is viewed. Becoming one in the way of looking at children and what it means to raise children. Becoming one in what it means to be one. You get the idea. And the challenge of marriage seems to be of two becoming one in all aspects of life. And it doesn't just happen, but rather is this process that seems to continually go throughout, making two more fully one. Now, notice that the text we read is Genesis chapter 2. Notice that it comes before Genesis chapter 3. And you say, yes, Daniel, very good. 2 does come before 3. Well done. But it matters. Because remember what happens in Genesis chapter 3? Sin enters the world. Genesis chapter 2 happens before sin enters the world. That we have here what God intended creation to be, how he created it to be, the perfection with which he created it to be. And part of that perfection was marriage, and part of that perfection, the perfect marriage, if you will, was oneness. That oneness is essential to have a good marriage as God intended, is essential for what he considered to be the perfect marriage. It's been my experience, because I do quite a bit of marriage counseling, it's been my experience that most couples want to have better marriages. Whether they are struggling or whether they have a great marriage, most couples want to have better marriages, want to have good marriages. And the question we kind of want to ask today is, how can we have a marriage more fully as what God intended, and that would be to be one. But I want us to look at how we might pursue that, how we might pursue the oneness God intended, how we might pursue the relationship that he intended. And the first is to leave. Don't rush ahead of me. Verse 24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. But there has to be a leaving of father and mother, a leaving of the previous life. Now, this idea of leave does not mean to abandon, because later we're told that children are to honor their parents. And Jesus will express that there's some element of even taking care of parents. So it can't be an abandonment of parents if we're also supposed to somehow take care of our parents. That can't be it. Rather, it is a reprioritization of what that familial relationship is. It's a reprioritization of what mother and father mean to each of this new family. But it's not the only relationship that is reprioritized. Friendships would be the same thing. That suddenly the way that we view friends, when we choose to hang out with friends, how we engage with friends has to be reprioritized in light of this new person with whom we are becoming one. It would be true of children as well. That how we understand children and look at children would have to be reprioritized, because they can't become more important than the one with whom we are one with. And it isn't even just relationships that become reprioritized. But every aspect of our life would need to be reprioritized in view of this person with whom we're becoming one. Of how we choose to look at finances. We can no longer look at it as this is just simply me. No longer look at it as simply a single individual would, because we're no longer single but are one. We can't look at careers the same way. Why? Because we're no longer single, but we are in fact one. Now, what's tied up in this idea of leaving one's father and mother is the idea of leaving the single life that we had and reprioritizing our life based upon that reality. When you hear the word jealousy, what comes to mind? What is the word jealousy? What connotations does that evoke? Most of the time we think in terms of something negative. Most of the time we think in terms of something selfish, that one person is selfishly wanting someone else. And to be clear, jealousy can be negative. Yet God is described as a jealous God, which means that jealousy can't only be negative. For God is a holy God and perfect in all things. So there has to be at least some aspect in which jealousy isn't necessarily bad, but could even be considered, I hesitate to say holy, but at least righteous. When was God jealous? He was jealous when the ones whom belonged to him forsook him and instead went to serve other gods. That those who were bound to him instead went elsewhere, looked elsewhere. husbands and wives have legitimate claims upon each other's time, legitimate claims upon each other's energy, legitimate claims upon each other's finances, legitimate claims upon even each other's bodies. Why? Because they are no longer two, but one. And there's such a thing as this righteous jealousy of when that which belongs to you is no longer given to you, or that which belongs to you is withheld from you. There's a sense in which this jealousy emerges because, well, that's rightfully mine. Of when husbands or wives choose to withhold that which belongs to their spouse, time, energy, money, resources, we could go down the list. Then there's this righteous jealousy that emerges because I'm supposed to be one. We're supposed to be one within this. I'm reminded of a scene from the movie Scrooge. If you've heard me before, you may have heard that during Christmas time, my family was committed to watching It's a Wonderful Life. I've seen It's a Wonderful Life so many times I can quote it. But what I found out whenever I think it was about high school, whenever I learned that my dad put a second movie on after we all went to bed, it was Scrooge. I don't know why he hid it from us, but he did. It was Scrooge. And there's a scene in Scrooge where Isabel, Scrooge's betrothed, comes to him there in his office. And he's sitting there, he's counting his money, and she comes, and there's a balance in front of her, and she takes her wedding ring and takes her engagement ring and sits it there on the balance, puts some money in, and the money is heavier. And she says, this is an example, this is what our relationship looks like. If you've weighed me, you've weighed my value and found it wanting in comparison to your career. But what we inevitably end up telling our spouse when we choose to continue to think like a single person, continue to no longer try and leave the life we once had, is we tell them that we've weighed their value and found them wanting. That if we want to have the relationship that God intended, if we want to have the best marriage that we could and try and pursue the perfect marriage as he intended, then it means leaving the life of singleness and instead looking to be one with our spouse. And that leads us to cleaving. Again, verse 24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Hold fast. If you got the King James Version, it's the idea of cleave, or the word cleave. I kind of like that because it rhymes really well with leave and cleave. I didn't come up with that. Cleave, cling, hold fast. That it's not merely the leaving of the life of singleness and the leaving of the previous life, but rather the holding fast to this new life with holding fast to this person with whom we are supposed to be one. To leave and to cling. But how do you cling to a person? How do you more fully become one? What does it mean? What does it look like? And I think we get a glimpse in Ephesians chapter 5. I want to look at verses 31 through 33. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 31 through 33. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Notice that Paul is going to tie the institution of marriage and how it is lived out there in verse 33. Let each of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. In his book, Love and Respect, Emerson Eggerichs draws attention to the reality that it's kind of interesting that the text doesn't say, husbands, love your wives, wives, love your husbands. It's kind of interesting that it's not just one statement for everybody, but that there's this idea of love and there's this idea of respect. And Eggerichs goes on to talk about that, in his opinion, that this perhaps addresses the greatest needs of both men and women. That is, that women need sacrificial love and men need respect in order to be able to feel loved. That in order for there to be a culture of love and be able to grow closer to one another, that women need to be shown sacrificial love and men need to be shown respect. What is the caveat that is given in that text? What is the exception that is given in that text? A little asterisk, if you will. Can you find it? It's not there. There is no caveat. There is no asterisk, which suggests that it's unconditional. That husbands are to unconditionally, sacrificially love their wives, to put their wives' needs and their wives' best interest above their own. But also that wives are to unconditionally respect their husbands. That is, to communicate her belief that he can in fact do things, that he can in fact make it through this life, can in fact lead the family into where they need to go. Each of us has a love bank. We have in ourselves a ledger, if you will, of all the interactions that we've ever had with any individual. And we either make deposits or withdrawals into this love bank, just like you would a normal bank. When you go to the store and you have a really positive interaction with somebody, they get a credit in your account because you felt good about it. It was a good experience. If you go to the store and it's a really negative experience, they make a withdrawal in your account because it really wasn't all that much fun. Now, what happens in your checkbook if you have a lot of cash in your account? You have what's called a surplus. What happens if you make too many withdrawals? You have a deficit. The same thing can happen in our lives. That if we have a lot of positive interactions with somebody, they make a lot of deposits into our love bank, and as a result, we feel really good about them. We want to hang out with them because that's a really great person, and all of our interactions have been good. If, however, all of our interactions are negative and we continue to make withdrawals and there is a deficit, I don't want anything to do with that person because I can't stand them. Because I feel like I'm having to give every time I'm around them, because you kind of are. What happens, or I guess maybe, why would you? Why would you choose to do things like show unconditional love or show unconditional respect? Because it suggests showing love when the other person doesn't deserve it. And it suggests showing respect when the other person hasn't earned it and doesn't deserve it. Why would you do that? Because we have this fear that, well, what happens if I show the other person love? Will they show me respect? What happens if I show respect? Will the other person show me love? And there's this little fear that if I do it unconditionally, the other person might not. So why would you choose to do it? It leads us to this. That it is to be done in God's presence. Notice that in verse 24, it begins with, Therefore a man will leave his father and his mother. Anytime you see that word therefore, it means because of what came before. So to understand what's taking place in verse 24, you also have to look back just a little bit. Look with me, if you will, at verses 22 and 23, I believe. Yes, 22 and 23. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Notice who brings Eve to Adam, who walks Eve down the aisle. It's God. Who officiates the first wedding? Also God. It is God who brings Adam and Eve together. It is God who officiates the first wedding. We oftentimes say that marriage is between one man and one woman, and that's mostly true, not entirely true. Marriage is between one man and one woman in the presence of God, or at least that's how it was intended to be. That it wasn't intended to be merely one man committed to one woman, but rather one man and one woman committed to one another as they are committed to God, or in the process of being committed to God. Because why would we do the hard things in marriage? Why would we show unconditional love? Why would we show unconditional respect? Really only because God told us to. And sometimes the only way we make it through the difficult times in life and the difficult times in relationship is choosing to apply the principles that God has given us in his word. For example, love your enemies. Have you ever felt like your spouse was your enemy? I noticed everybody's heads got really still. Of course you have. It's called marriage. That at some point in time, you're going to feel a little bit like your spouse is your enemy, and yet we're still supposed to show love to that person. Why? Because God said so. We're supposed to show unconditional love and unconditional respect, even if the other person didn't deserve it. Why? Because God said so. That if we're to have the marriage that God intended, we have to leave our previous life, to cling to our spouse, but do so in the presence of God. And as we do that, we learn something about God. Did you notice in Ephesians 5 that Paul said that the becoming one is the indication of Christ and the church, or at least reflects to and applies to Christ and the church? Have you ever wondered, why did God create the family? Why did he create marriage? After all, you're fully aware that marriage is not necessary for procreation. So why? Why create it? Why create family? What was the point in it all? And I can't help but wonder if perhaps the reason why he creates it, besides just to add some flavor to life, is because he uses those same familial principles to describe his relationship throughout the Bible. He'll describe himself as Father. Christ is our brother. We are brothers and sisters in Christ. He'll refer to the relationship between Christ and the church as that of husband and wife. God himself will refer to his relationship with Israel as a husband and wife, that he uses familiar language all throughout so that we might come to understand him. Which I suspect is also why Satan attacks marriage and attacks family so vehemently. Because if it were to be removed, our ability to understand God would be diminished. Because he uses those ideas to help us understand. Also why it's important for us to talk about family. Every November we talk about family in some way. Why? Because it is through family that we come to understand God. Not the only way that we understand him, but one of the primary ways we come to understand him and what it means to be Christian. You might remember that Jesus says, anyone who would come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. You know what that really sounds close to? Anyone who would come after me must leave and cleave. Sounds pretty close, doesn't it? Anyone who would come after me must deny himself, leave his previous life, take up his cross, and follow me, cleave or cling to me. That it seems that on a daily basis, as husbands and wives choose to leave their previous life and cling to one another, that in that process, they come to practice the exact things that they need in order to follow Christ. The leaving of their previous life and the continual choosing and clinging to the life they have in Christ. There was a time, especially on the plains, when winter would come, a farmer would take a rope out to his barn and would tie a rope from his barn to his house. And the purpose of that rope was this: when a blizzard would come through and you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and you certainly couldn't see the barn, there was a very real danger that you might inadvertently wander off into a field somewhere and freeze to death. And so they would take this rope and tie it from their house to their barn so they could hold that rope and know exactly how to get from their house to their home. Every day, our marriages, our relationships are bombarded with all kinds of things. Continually trying to get us off track and knock us off track, and all we can do is cling to one another like those farmers clung to those ropes in the midst of the blizzard. Perhaps you're here today, and you want to begin a relationship with the one who loves you most, the one who sacrificed everything that you might have a relationship with him, and that starts at baptism. Or perhaps you're here today and need the prayers of the church. If there's any way we can assist you, won't you come as together we stand and sing?